Hideo Kojima is known today mainly for his 3D action games. This is a video about his less well-known projects in the West that actually made him the game designer he is today, Snatcher and Policenauts. Hideo Kojima wanted to make arcade games. Instead, Konami assigned him to PC titles. Metal Gear was created to emulate the high-speed rush of Capcom's arcade hit Commando for a platform that was severely weaker than any arcade cabinet. After the relative success of Kojima's first game, Kojima was able to create a new IP around the platform instead of the other way around. At the beginning of Japan's entry into game development, they had the advantage over games in English that their language's characters as symbols took up less space. As a result, a key Japanese genre emerged called the visual novel. Visual novels tend to be less interactive and heavier on text than their Western counterpart, the adventure game. Adventure games, meanwhile, developed around puzzle solving and branching possible endings as methods of taking the gameplay variety that could be found in role-playing games and applying that to storytelling. Given the way a visual novel or adventure game on a PC 8801 could be far more cinematic than on the MSX, Kojima got to work on crafting his next game as a kind of love letter to sci-fi, anime, and manga, drawing inspiration from Blade Runner, the Terminator, Akira, and Gunbuster. Kojima and character designer Tomiharu Kinoshita assembled together a small team of devs to create something unique for the platform and genre. Kojima envisioned video games one day supplanting cinema as the biggest format in the world for storytelling and popular art. Snatcher was about more than crafting a love letter to the team's influences. It was about proving to a small cult audience that games could be part of capital C culture one day in their own right, and not only as fun diversions just to pass the time. Right away, this goal took on the form of what art theorists refer to as medium specificity, doing things only the given format can. One idea that Konami would reject was to conceal a secret message on the game's floppy disks, which, when heat activated, would tip the player off to their existence by filling the room via a chemical reaction with the scent of blood. Fitting, given at its core, Snatcher is a police-style investigation game. Snatcher puts you in the role of Gillian Seed, the newest member of a secret police unit, J.U.N.K.E.R. It's been 50 years since a pathogen ravaged the world, and now mysterious entities called Snatchers are stealing the identities and appearances of important members of society. As a J.U.N.K.E.R, Seed must determine the truth of these so-called bioroids, while also trying to regain memories he's lost in a strange accident shrouded in mysteries of its own. But as Kojima would later say, the game was intentionally created as something of a pastiche to draw more focus onto the entire world, which, unlike the somewhat broadly written characters here, is packed with detailed originality. Plus, the mimicking and repetition derived from its influences speaks to the game's central idea of a substanceless identity, of something that is what it looks like in appearance only. Snatcher provides a totally unique blend of interactivity and narrative. Your investigation kicks off when John Jack Gibson, the man who would have been your partner, radios in that he's cornered a pair of Snatchers in an abandoned factory. Following up on Gibson's leads would take you, alongside your faithful navigator Metal Gear Mark II, all over the neon-lit, decadent Neo-Kobe city. From its slums, to its bustling shopping centers, to its hospitals, and even its nightclubs. What emerges is a pointillistic portrait, if you will, of an entire society, but dressed by helpful intel that you can optionally ascertain from J.U.N.K.E.R HQ's supercomputer, Jordan. Snatcher has an ambitious yet playful verve and vivacity that matches uniquely well with its late-night, hard R-rated sci-fi flick or mature manga aesthetic. Gillian is actually quite goofy, not to mention deeply flawed. And all this works wonders getting across the central theme of appearances versus reality. As characteristic of all of Kojima's games, Snatcher uses a number of fourth wall breaks and meta-narrative devices. Snatcher would use a new approach to adventure game design that fused it together with the visual novel. Later called by its creators the multi-process story, this approach inverted the typical one found in the genre by freeing up player choice on a moment-to-moment level. For the first time, even minute player actions could be acknowledged and cause small changes within the flow of the game. In some respects, how Snatcher worked as a multi-process story could be called a precursor to what today we call the open-world game genre. Unfortunately, Kojima's small staff still had a lot to learn about the video game production cycle. He gravitated typically towards working with outsiders, outcasts, and novices, which over time would generate, by the days of 1998's Metal Gear Solid, the best outside-the-box ideas that would put this development studio on the map. But initially, this inexperience led to problems. Even after a year and a half of development, Snatcher remained only roughly halfway completed, and Konami was not willing to provide enough time or money to finish it entirely. Even with their truncation, by the end, Snatcher would take 2 to 3 times longer to create than a typical game in 1988. Even worse, it would have to end on a cliffhanger. Another change during development was about Snatcher's platform. Even though it was initially built around the PC 8801, Konami insisted mid-production that a version also be ported onto the MSX. Doing so would require manufacturing a special accessory to boost the MSX's onboard sound and memory. Instead of a point-and-click interface, Snatcher uses a set of command prompts, words like look, investigate, inventory, and so on. This provides a voyeuristic component to the game, one that arguably translates the cinematic philosophy of Alfred Hitchcock into video game form. In other more traditional adventure games, when trying to solve a puzzle, very rarely is a wrong answer or deduction acknowledged by the game. But Snatcher is full of specialized dialogue and scenes that trigger only outside the essential actions needed for moving the story forward. This brings a personalization to the experience, even if you make the wrong move, so to speak, with lots of variety from one person's playthrough to another's. And it's all thanks to the multi-process story paradigm. The game would be ported several times during a period in the early 90s of extraordinary expansion for not only the games industry, but the wider digital age. As the underlying technology was growing exponentially, game developers could barely keep up. Each port of Snatcher, for the most part, then, as a result, is markedly different from the last, but they all remain examples of the multi-process story. When Snatcher finally debuted in late 1988, it was popular enough to warrant a home console release. But the devs couldn't fit such a large game that took up multiple floppy disks onto a simple cartridge like the kind used by the ubiquitous Famicom or the new Sega Genesis. Their only choice was the PC Engine, known in the West as the TurboGrafx 16. Using its cutting-edge Super CD-ROM squared system, Snatcher's devs could not only add a concluding third act, they could also add a key element that only games of the future would widely feature: CD-based sound. It would be the first time Kojima's production team would work with the CD format, but certainly not the last. Another new feature ahead of its time would be specially animated cutscenes, which required artist Satoshi Yoshioka to create bespoke facial expressions and more detailed character graphics. The original game's huge load times and relative lack of in-depth or high-paced animations were gone. In their place emerged a style that directly anticipated the coming age of a Hollywood game, true to Kojima's initial ideas for the project during its infancy. Another historic first would be the release of what today we call a game demo for Snatcher's PC Engine port. Back then, because there wasn't a name for it yet, Kojima's team dubbed it simply a pilot disc, like a pilot episode of a TV show. But though the only version of Snatcher to be officially released in the West was the 1994 to 95 port on the Sega CD, Kojima wasn't involved in its creation. By that point, he and the rest of his team, now known internally at Konami as Kaihatsu Gobu or Development Section 5, had moved on to their next IP, Policenauts. Ideas for Policenauts had originated during the fraught development process for the original Snatcher. The game had been such a memory hog, development had to completely stop for a period to search for a technical solution. It was then, in his downtime, that Kojima began to devise the kernel for what would become Policenauts. The space detective project would debut on the PC 9821. The platform featured high-resolution display and larger storage, and by the early 90s, it was leading a revival of Japanese dating sims and visual novels. It was also associated with eroge, a Japanese porn game genre. Drawing on these specifics, Policenauts would emerge as an extremely adult game. The PC-98 original version of Policenauts would use impressive pixel art. Though the long load times and generally slow gameplay pace from the original Snatcher returned, it fit much better with a space colony setting. The priority for Kojima's team, first and foremost, was high production values. Policenauts would feature a cinematic blend between gameplay and narrative, while still retaining several key features that had been found in Snatcher. It was only after Kojima received a letter from a hearing-impaired fan that, for the first Policenauts port, the team would add a feature that would become an industry standard in the 21st century: subtitles. Bringing on board the talents of a certain artist named Yoji Shinkawa, the ports for first the 3DO and then the PSX and eventually the Sega Saturn changed the high-res pixel style to cell animation, created with the help of Anime International Company. The Saturn edition would also become compatible with a light gun accessory, which gave Policenauts a feeling of fusion between a Hollywood movie, a visual novel, and an arcade game. Policenauts, originally named Beyond, was created during the early 90s, a time of momentous change, as I mentioned, both inside the gaming medium and beyond. Japan was entering its so-called lost decade, a recession that badly impacted the country for an entire generation. Yet at the same time, the Japanese were making great strides in two fields: bioethics and spaceflight. Throughout the 1980s, great controversy had emerged in Japan surrounding the concept of brain death. Was a brain-dead person legally dead? And if so, could their organs be donated and their life support cut off by the government? In 1983, writes Masahiro Morioka, quote, "The Ministry of Health and Welfare established a committee on brain death and transplantation. More than 100 books concerning these subjects were published in Japan from 1985 to the early 90s. The special committee presented its final report in 1992, end quote. Meanwhile, TV journalist Toyohiro Akiyama in 1990 became the first Japanese person to go to space. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, Japan was positioned to buy up much of their space technology. But this subject of Japan's presence on the international economic and cultural stage was perhaps a sore one for some Americans, as the US was still smarting in the early 90s from a small recession of its own that came about following the Gulf War. The infamous, long-lasting American xenophobia against Asians, known as Fear of the Yellow Peril, reared its head again when, in 1992, Michael Crichton wrote a stridently anti-Japanese screed in the form of a whodunit murder mystery named Rising Sun. Even worse, the 1993 film adaptation, starring Sean Connery and Wesley Snipes, played on certain ongoing racial tensions then in Los Angeles by pitting Black Americans against Asians on screen. It was with all these issues in the background that Hideo Kojima and much of the dev team that had worked on 1988's Snatcher created the adventure game Policenauts. Policenauts is a half-satire, then, of the concept of Japanese corporate culture, and also a half-serious critique. It reflects on the subjects of space travel and bioethics like no other game in history, while taking aim at what might be called the modern medical-industrial complex. But the game would do so as an experiment in this new era of gaming as yet another multi-process story. Snatcher had been called a cyberpunk adventure, and Policenauts Kojima wanted but couldn't, because of copyright issues, to call the genre of virtual reality. He settled for interactive cinema. Policenauts was created as a kind of hard, rated R buddy cop story mixed outrageously with the genre known as hard science fiction. The game would take the visual novel genre into new unexplored frontiers. Policenauts would use a point-and-click driven interface, as well as a method of audio streaming that would get recycled by Konami on multiple other games, including 1998's Metal Gear Solid and the publisher's several entries in the Tokimeki Memorial series during the 1990s. The extensive use of voice acting in Policenauts was very ahead of its time, and the glossary included in the Saturn port gave players an unbelievably in-depth resource for all the game's terminology, science, culture, and more. In this regard, Policenauts can only be compared to Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, which similarly went to insane depths when creating the film's wider world beyond what the audience would directly see on screen. Because Policenauts is a point-and-click style adventure game, the degree of detail it offers is simply staggering when it comes to observational data. This is where the concept I mentioned of virtual reality comes to the fore in a way unlike most titles in this genre. And it fits the role you play as an investigator. You can carefully observe virtually every possible detail, which will either provide important story information, foreshadowing, or just build your sense of immersion. The downside is it's easier in Policenauts than Snatcher to get stuck, given sometimes the answer is buried under a mountain of possible clues. In this regard, it's more like a conventional adventure game of the era, maybe. There's also one scenario in particular that's almost guaranteed to stymie your progress, involving bomb disposal, where you not only have to painstakingly compare handbags in a department store to find the one with the bomb in it, but also carefully dismantle the bomb piece by piece as a timer ticks down. It's a nice attention and commitment to detail, and a good use of tension, but it takes a while to really get down. And though Policenauts does have a lot of innuendo and titillation, two of its casts would arguably prove to be some of the best written women characters in Kojima's entire body of work, so it's a bit of a mixed bag in this regard. There's Meryl, who would return in a different form for the Metal Gear Solid series, whose tough exterior hides a compassionate soul. And then there's Karen Hojo, a deeply complex person suffering from a terrible illness brought about by exposure to cosmic radiation. The inclusion of sexual content to Policenauts may have fit the PC-98's context well enough, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit that today, almost 30 years later, its gender politics haven't aged the best. It assumes the player is a typical straight Japanese male because most of them at the time and on the PC-98 probably were. And while I'm on the subject of issues modern players might have with Policenauts, it's just as undeniable that somewhere down the pipeline, the change from pixel art to cell animation arguably gives the key character, Ed Brown, an appearance some might find racially insensitive or even full-blown racist, especially compared to how he looks in the original game. This could relate to a diminished color palette for the 32-bit consoles, but if we compare the two styles of Ed, the cell animation version leaves his mouth often strangely discolored or yellow, and warps the intent of an homage to Lethal Weapon star Danny Glover, even if it's unintentionally, into something some could charge comes close to looking like blackface. So in our era, where players of any nationality, gender, and race have access to the game and are more established as part of the global player base, Policenauts is maybe exclusionary in a way today it wasn't meant to be in 1994. That being said, the sexual content in the game isn't as explicit as an actual porn game. Most of it's optional, all of it's playful, and as for Ed, there's no doubting his character itself is portrayed respectfully and lovingly, even if how he sometimes appears in the game could have been handled maybe better by the Studio Animation International company for today's standards. But ironically, that's part of Policenauts' charm. It was created at a time when there were less codified rules about how developers use the new technology in the early and mid-90s to push the bounds of immersion and realism. Policenauts accomplishes a lot with a little, and in that sense, it's still an important game within the medium's history. Not only would Meryl return for MGS1, the way Policenauts provides a little summary every time you load a save would too. Numerous other nods to the game would carry over as well, especially in terms of character resemblances. The Coroner Victor, for example, would look a bit like Revolver Ocelot, while Commander of Beyond Coast Police Becker Gates would resemble MGS1's Secretary of Defense Jim Houseman. Policenauts and Snatcher may be dated today, but they were each in their own way trailblazers that helped set the stage for Kojima Productions and their widely beloved series of spy action games, Metal Gear Solid. MGS would continue to advance the concept of the multi-process story into the 3D and eventually DVD and big data eras. But even considered just as adventure games, the two early Hideo Kojima releases were some of the finest ever made, that all fans of the format should check out. I recommend the Sega CD version of Snatcher in English and the fan-translated version of Policenauts on Sega Saturn. Check the links in the description below on how to play them yourself. Until next time, boss.